Call to order our June 16th Cary Planning and Zoning meeting, and we're going to begin with adoption of our agenda. Do we have any adjustments? If not, can I get a motion to adopt?
So moved.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion second. Discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries unanimously. And then we need to approve our May 12th work session minutes. Do we have any adjustments? Hearing none, I'd like a motion on that one.
So moved.
We have a motion, second?
Second.
Motion and second, discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries unanimously. And then finally, we need to approve our May 19th regular meeting minutes. Again, any changes? If not, a motion?
I move that we approve the May 19th meeting minutes.
We have a motion and a second. Mr.
I'll second that one.
You were in there, all right. Discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries unanimously. And that brings us to our public hearings for the evening. I believe we have 3 of them. Before we start, I'd like to just lay out a couple of logistic details for you. For each of our public hearings, we're going to start with a member of staff presenting the case at the podium to my left, to your right. Following their presentation, I'm going to open the public hearing, and the first speaker will be the applicant, if they choose to speak to us, and they will have 10 minutes to speak to us. Once they have delivered their presentation, anyone else that wishes to speak to us on any of these public hearing cases is free to approach the clerk over to my right. Wave your hand, please. Using these stairs. And then please speak at the podium to my right, which is to your left. When I ask you that you be concise, that you avoid repetition, where you have many of you that agree with the same perspective, maybe you can pick a representative to represent your perspective. And please direct your comments to the full board. We will not interact with you. This is our chance to listen. I also ask you to respect the fact that this is a business meeting. With that said, we'll begin with our first case, which I believe is 14 REZ06, the Howard property. Ms. Behrman. Hey.
Good evening. This is a public hearing on a request to rezone about 6.14 acres at 7216 Carpenter Fire Station Road. Property is on the north side of Carpenter Fire Station Road, adjacent to Cameron Pond. The existing zoning on the property is R40, and the proposed zoning is transitional residential conditional use. The initial zoning conditions when this was presented at the Town Council public hearing included limiting the land use to detached dwellings with a maximum density of 3.5 units per acre and a maximum lot size of 8,000 square feet. Based on some discussion at the public hearing, there have been some changes to the conditions, which is why this is before you at a public hearing this evening. The revised conditions include, again, limiting the use to detached dwellings with a maximum density of 2.9 units per acre and a minimum lot size of 6,000 square feet. The reason for these changes goes back to evaluating the property with regard to the land use plan and consistency with the land use plan. It is in the Northwest Area Plan with the designation of medium density residential. It is subject to Note 19 in the Northwest Area Plan, which includes a broad area that's encompassed by the blue line that you see here. Within Note 19, it calls for a mix of 2 or more residential use types, excluding multifamily, calls for a variety of lot sizes, and the overall density of 3 to 8 units per acre. Upon further evaluation of this, staff does feel that this request could be consistent with the land use plan, even if the density on this site is slightly lower than the 3.0 units per acre due to the large area that's encompassed as part of that note, where there's a larger area to be the target for those land use considerations. There is a stream buffer shown on the site according to Cary's GIS maps, and field determination of this would be made at the time of the site plan review. There are no parks or greenway facilities in the area that would be a factor in the development of the site. According to Cary's transportation plan, Carpenter Fire Station Road is a major thoroughfare. The areas that are highlighted in yellow show the properties that were notified of the public hearing. We did receive 2 protest petitions. The one in yellow to the north of the property is valid, and the one shown in blue is ineligible due to its distance from the site. The concerns that were expressed in the protest petitions included density, traffic, the transition to the surrounding neighborhood, the connection to Cameron Pond, general concerns with changing the landscape and scenery in the area, increases in erosion, and decreases in property value. At the public hearing, there were several concerns that were expressed by speakers at the public hearing, and these included pedestrian safety related to the extension of Russo Valley Drive, which is an existing road in Cameron Pond that stubs to that subdivision that would potentially be extended through the property. Also, concerns related to crossing Carpenter Fire Station Road. There was also mention of stormwater runoff as a concern and tree removal and perimeter buffers. Also, at the public hearing, Town Council expressed gave some feedback. One was to consider traffic calming and a pedestrian signal, along Carpenter Fire Station Road with the existing intersection through Cameron Pond. Also, consideration for reducing the density to less than 3 units per acre to trigger the requirement in the ordinance that would prohibit mass grading, and there has been a zoning condition proposed to accomplish that. And also to evaluate the plan consistency if the density is slightly less than 3 units per acre. And again, as I mentioned, we did take a look at that and feel like that could be found to be consistent. That concludes staff's comments, and I'll now call on the applicant for any further comments.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to open the public hearing, and we will begin by hearing from our applicant, please.
Hey, thanks, guys. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
Can we start by hearing your name, please?
I'm sorry, I'm Mark Miller, applicant.
Excellent.
Yeah, we are attempting to rezone this to a lower density than what is currently planned for. Our plan is to come in here and build homes consistent with Cameron Pond, higher in value, consistent in pricing and kind of square footages. You know, we're not sure yet, but we think it's going to be in the 2,500 to 3,500 square foot range, same type of amenity levels, same type of look and feel of a higher end nature. So, you know, our intention isn't to devalue properties by any means, and we haven't gotten into the site plan analysis of it yet, but we do, you know, we plan to put some buffers in there to, you know, keep everything consistent and in good nature with what Cary has established to date. So that's our plan. We have had a conversation with Ms. Dudek on the protest petition, and we are trying to work with her on the connection situation. It's my understanding that that's the biggest concern, and we're trying to explain that, the process of it, and as we get through into the site plan, we can do more of that. But you know, we're trying to address that situation with those folks. And that's it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Do we have anyone else then that would like to speak to us on this case?
Here's one.
Good evening, how are you? My name is Scott DeCoste. I live at 505 Simbury Glen Court, which is one of 5 homes on the cul-de-sac that extends off of Russo Valley Drive, and really only one of 2 homes that will be impacted by the development of the site that actually abuts to this new development. I would just like to get some clarity on the buffer zone. I saw that the 30-foot is the standard issue from town related, plus an additional 20-foot of buffer zone that was put in by the builder. We would like to see if we can, since of only one of 2 homes that actually is really impacted by this site, try to extend the buffer zone just on that west side of the property that will abut next to the water runoff on our location up to Carpenter Fire Station Road to gain that and keep that privacy that we have known to love, for the last few years that we actually own the home. And also there is some talk about removal of the existing vegetation in the area. It's a very mature vegetation, very dense vegetation, very vital for the environment that's behind our home there. We'd like to try to see if we can maintain or keep that intact, or if that is going to be taken down, what kind of vegetation is going to be brought back into this area, so we can see what kind of zone or alignment we'll have with the rest of the community that's being put in behind us in this location that's up in question. That's really all I have for tonight.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Would anyone else like to address us on this case? Anyone? Up, please come down.
Sir, fill us out when you're done, please.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. This one here?
That's it, thank you.
All right, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt McIntyre. I live on 313 Russo Valley Drive. It's the 3rd house from the end of the road there. The main reason that I came was really to reiterate what the last person said around the buffer. I read through the report, and I actually was a little confused whether, it was going to be it was going to stay 50 feet or it would be reduced to 30 feet, if it was 30 plus 20 or 30 or 20. Was just hoping for some clarity around that, but I agree with the previous speaker that the vegetation there and the wildlife would be negatively affected, I think. So I'm concerned about that. The other thing that I'm concerned about is when the site plan is developed around potential construction traffic on Russo Valley Drive. That street has been, along with Simbury, there has been under construction for about 6 years or so. It's just about finished, and I'm not sure how the roads are going to connect. I don't really have clarity on that, whether Russo Valley Drive is going to be extended to Sanger, or if there will be another road that comes in from Carpenter Fire Station Road. But if they are connected, I would hope that there could be some consideration about having construction traffic come in off of Carpenter Fire Station Road instead of coming around through our neighborhood. And then the last thing is really just to reiterate a concern about a previous meeting around the crossing the street at Carpenter Fire Station Road. I read through the report and noticed that Carpenter Fire Station Road would have to be adjusted to be 4 lanes earlier than it is. And there's been recent road widening in that area where we all cross the street to go to the pool and the playground and so forth over there. And I noticed the speeds of the cars get a lot higher just as they come around the corner and the road widens. So I really feel that if the road widens earlier, it's going to be even more difficult for the residents in that area to be able to cross the street. So a crosswalk or a traffic light or something would be greatly appreciated. Okay, that's all I had. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to us? Seeing no one getting up, I think I'm going to close the public hearing and open this case for questions from the board. Do we have questions? Mr. Werner.
Couple questions about the issue about this mass grading. Why does reducing the density eliminate the need for mass grading?
According to the land, there's a section in the land development ordinance that if you're developing at a medium density, which is at least 3 units per acre, 3 to 8 units per acre, that there is a limit on how much area can be disturbed at one time. You can go up to 25 acres with mass grading to prepare the site for the development at that density. Where you have a density that's less than 3 units per acre, then the grading occurs more on a lot-by-lot basis, and you can, you can grade for utilities and streets and the infrastructure, but you're not allowed to do the 25-acre grading at one time that you would be able to do per the ordinance if the density was a little bit higher.
Okay. Number 2, what is the density, I think it's Cameron Pond, is that to the west? What is the density of that development?
This portion of Cameron Pond through here, the density is about 5 units per acre net and 3 units per acre gross. The median lot size in that area is about 6,600 square feet.
So it's comparable to what the
Comparable.
developer or the applicant's proposing?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Excellent. Other questions? Mr. Miller?
I'd like to visit the buffer issue that was brought up by the 2 speakers at the public hearing. If I understand correctly from the staff report, the requirement is for a 20-foot type B buffer to the west between Cameron Pond and
The requirement was actually, the requirement per the land development ordinance is a 20-foot landscape area because of the type 2 uses that would back up to each other. The applicant has proposed a zoning condition that would make that a 20-foot buffer. So that would be a 20-foot area that would be within the homeowners association for the development to be built. And then the lots, so the lots themselves would be outside of that at least 20 feet away. So the total width of the buffer would be I believe, 30 feet that's on the side of Cameron Pond, plus the 20-foot buffer that would be on the subject property.
Okay. So it's the 30 feet that exists on the Cameron Pond, and the applicant here has requested a zoning condition for 20 feet additional for a total of 50.
Right. Without that zoning condition, the requirement would be the outer 20 feet of the property would be required to be landscaped, but it would not be a separate buffer.
And that can be done by maintaining existing vegetation, or would it be a mix?
Well, at the time of the site plan, we would evaluate the vegetation that's in that buffer. If it was adequate, then it would be maintained. If it was not adequate to meet the type B standards, then it would need to be supplemented.
Okay. Thank you. And one other question, the lot that had the protest petition, does that make for an entire valid protest petition for the entire?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Yes. As far as traffic is concerned, and I say that there's not a traffic study required on this, but I was wondering if Mr. Jensen or someone can address one issue, and that is, do you know what, if any, effect there will be on the nearby intersection of NC 55 with Carpenter Fire Station? Has there been any kind of analysis of that?
There was no traffic study required by our LDO to be made as part of this case, so it hasn't been looked at. My professional opinion is that the number of units that they're proposing probably have some effect at the intersection, but probably be very negligible compared to the amount of, there's just a lot of traffic going through that intersection, so it'd be a very small increment of impact there.
But some effect?
Some effect, sure.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Other questions? Oh, please.
Can you address briefly what we know at this point about how Russo Valley might connect to Sanger or any of those connectivity issues? Or is it too early to really know what's going on with that?
It's too early to know. That's something that would be addressed at the subdivision stage. We have not seen a subdivision sketch with this. It's not part of the rezoning process. it will, our expectation initially would be when the subdivision is submitted for it to connect to Russo Valley. There is an intervening off-site portion of right-of-way that it will be up to the applicant between now and then to try to work with the adjoining property owner to acquire that for that road connection to occur. If that doesn't occur, then that would be evaluated at the time to see what other options were available to ensure that traffic flow and safety were maintained with however the development is designed.
But without connection to Russo Valley, the only other connections, assuming whether it was one or two, to the property onto Carpenter Fire Station would involve right in, right out?
I can't answer that question at this point. I mean, in terms of the specific access configurations.
Right. Required because of a median in Carpenter Fire Station. Okay. Do you know if there will be a median?
I don't know. Perhaps Mr. Jensen has more information about that.
I would envision probably they're going to desire at least one access off Carpenter Fire Station Road. Again, that hasn't been vetted, but I would think that they would want one. Probably the connectivity in that whole area. There'll be, with all this property that may redevelop, eventually we would hope that a system of connecting roads could go over to Highcroft Drive. That's going to hopefully be extended from the south and connect up with Carpenter Fire Station Road. That's kind of where our main collector road would be. So, our connecting streets would try to focus towards getting to that street. But certainly an access off Carpenter Fire Station Road certainly could be something that could be considered and evaluated. That would have to go through NCDOT for their review and approval. But it's just too early in this stage to really say for sure. But again, whether the roadway itself is planned to be a median divided roadway. Yes. So in essence, I think we would probably be looking at a right-in, right-out only driveway if they chose to go that route. Mm-hmm. There would have to be something done with Russo Valley Drive. We only allow a maximum dead-end road of 900 feet. So it's going to somehow have to connect to another road that may lead out to Carpenter Fire Station Road.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Mm-hmm. Can I take advantage of Mr. Jensen? I'm sorry.
He almost made it.
I'm trying to think of a couple of examples that might be a little similar to this scenario with the swim club playground area on a split development. I know there's one up on, I think it's, Evans Road, where there's a swim club right there by the side of the road, and part of that development's on the other side of Evans Road. What have we done in the past where there's this issue of people wanting to cross a somewhat, I would almost imagine Evans Road is busier than this street right now?
Well, we do look at where there is a high pedestrian activity. We look at particularly at side streets that have enough volume along the side streets for both pedestrian and vehicular that we could actually put a signal there to help both the vehicular and pedestrian movement. A lot of cases, though, the vehicular traffic isn't of high enough value to justify a traffic signal. In those cases, then sometimes we will look at possibly putting in some sort of mid-block crossing, a crosswalk crossing, particularly those major thoroughfares that have multiple lanes and higher speeds. It's really important that if we put a crosswalk there that we supplement that with some other type of traffic control, whether it be in some of the things that we're experimenting with right now is rectangular flashing beacons. Those work well predominantly on median divided roadways. Some of the more some of those crossings perhaps that may have a lot of pedestrians crossing the road and maybe a wider road, we may have to be even more aggressive, maybe a more advanced type of hybrid signal for pedestrians. We don't have any in Cary right now. They're very expensive to justify the use of those. And again, you get varying degrees of compliance of whether people are actually going to stop at those. And so that we have, in this particular location, we've looked at the possibility of putting a traffic signal at Cameron Pond at Carpenter Fire Station. And when we did our study about 2 years ago, it was kind of complaint driven from the residents there trying to get across the pool. We just didn't have enough vehicular volume coming out of the side streets to justify a full traffic signal with crosswalks. So in this particular area, again, with a multi-lane roadway without any really median in that area, probably putting a more advanced signal is going to be maybe difficult too. But those really just got to justify a lot of pedestrian traffic going across it to really justify the cost of putting in there. So that certainly is something that is ongoing and we're continuing to look at, but we haven't committed to put anything there at this point in time. And again, if we did choose to put something there, that would have to be approved by NCDOT as well. So,
thank you.
Good.
And to justify and get permission from the DOT and all for a traffic signal, you have to have at least a certain amount of vehicular traffic. You can't do it entirely on pedestrian traffic.
Yeah, there are guidelines to go by. There are different what we refer to as warrants that would justify a traffic signal. Traffic volume is one of those warrants, and there's like 5 or 6 of, depending on the time of day. There's also a pedestrian warrant and things of that nature too. So there's a lot of things that go into play before we actually put a new signal in the system. It just when you add a new signal, it does have some ramifications for flow of traffic along the roadway. That's why we use those guidelines.
But it can't be justified purely on pedestrian. It has to involve the
Probably not. That probably is not something the DOT would look at as just meeting that sole warrant. They would probably want several warrants to be justified before they put a signal out there.
Okay.
Other questions?
I'd like to ask one point of clarification with regard to the buffers on between proposed site and the Cameron Pond. As I understand, there's a 30-foot buffer that currently exists on the Cameron Pond development.
Correct.
And what is being proposed by the applicant at this point in time is a 20-foot buffer and the new site.
That's
correct. Could you give us some clarification as to why the difference between Cameron Pond is 30 feet and now 20 foot that's proposed on this site?
The requirement is the 20-foot landscape area with when I would have to go back and look at the specific rezoning conditions for Cameron Pond, but when that development was done, a decision was made with, between what was required by the ordinance and what the applicant chose to offer in addition to come up with the specific layout of the open space and the buffer there. In this case, the requirement is, again, is the 20-foot landscape area based on the adjacent uses. And then at the time of the rezoning, the applicant has the opportunity to increase the requirement that they would be subject to, which is what has been done in this case.
Okay, but as it stands now, the applicant has already proposed the inclusion of a buffer as opposed to just a landscape area.
That's correct. So it would be an additional 20 feet that without that condition would not be there.
So he's already moved towards exceeding the minimum requirements for that.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? I'd just like to make a clarification. No matter what develops within the existing zoning on this property, Carpenter Fire Station Road is going to be widened, right?
That's the widening of Carpenter Fire Station is what's shown on comprehensive transportation plan. So at the time, any development on this property would trigger the road widening.
Okay, so the point is that it doesn't matter what development happens here, that road's going to get widened. Now, we do need to address the issue of pedestrian crossing, but we can't fix that issue by saying nothing can develop on this land.
That's correct.
Great. Any other questions? In that case, do we have a motion, please?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion. I move that the board forward case number 14 REZ06 to Town Council with a recommendation for approval, as it is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans, and is reasonable and in the public interest for the reasons set forth in the staff report and presentation.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, who spoke first then?
Doesn't matter.
Bill, I think you won that one.
Sure.
Discussion.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, it appears that with the reduced density that there's a reasonable transition between this site and their neighbors to the west. Staff has already looked at the fact that the density is slightly higher than the land use plan, but they find it acceptable. Also, I find that it's commendable that the applicant, after the town council meeting, made the concession in regard to density, and for those reasons, I believe that it should be approved.
Other comments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. There's a lot to like about this, particularly the reduction in density. I applaud, and it is fitting, I think, with the general neighborhood and the way that development is going. However, there is a traffic problem. I fully understand that there was not a traffic analysis for this one particular rezoning. However, if you look at traffic analysis that have been done in the past, and I'll single out just one of several that I've looked at, but it's typical, 14 TAR 387, a very recent traffic study, showed that already we're expecting a background without this project and without some other projects that have been proposed of F level of service at the Carpenter Fire Station NC 55 intersection. Not only is that an F, it is about 3 times failing. So as far as its delay time. And while we're only making this a small amount worse, we're making it a little bit worse. Then you add in any other developments that come along, including some that have been proposed and are being analyzed for the traffic, it becomes a lot worse. And if something is failing now, in fact, worse than failing, we shouldn't make it any worse, not even just a little bit worse. So for that reason, I'm going to have to oppose this.
Other comments?
Yeah, I'll note that from a rezoning perspective, I agree with Mr. Werner that the reduced density does help with the transition. It also, I think, because it prohibits the mass grading, I think that is a positive for the rezoning case as well. And I think with the addition of the 20 feet of additional buffer that the applicant has offered as a zoning condition, along with the reduced density, it seems to address the major concerns that were expressed, things like consistency and transition to the neighboring developments, things like stormwater and erosion, those sorts of things. And so from a rezoning perspective, I think this is very positive, primarily because of the reduction in density and the buffer. I do understand the concern about the connection of Russo Valley Drive for the neighboring property owner. From a rezoning perspective, it's difficult to make a determination on that because it is a site plan determination and we don't even know if it will be extended. So I think it's a valid concern, but from a rezoning perspective, I think this has a lot of positives, and the density reduction primarily is one that makes me support the motion. So.
Other comments? Well, I'm going to pipe in then. Every time we get into a case that is out in Western Cary, we run into the same two issues. I'm surprised that no one raised schools, because that seems to come up in every one of these. Traffic is going to be an issue. And we have this really ugly kind of dilemma. Carpenter Fire Station Road and NC 55 are state DOT roads. They will choose to maintain, enhance them as they choose. But they constrain our ability to move traffic around Cary to make these kinds of projects viable. The good news is this case doesn't give us very much impact. If this were 1,000 homes, I would be with Mr. Shaw here freaking out, because we do have a huge problem and we need a long-term solution that has nothing to do with this parcel or this applicant. But I think on balance, this one is far less egregious than some would be. If no one else has a comment, I'm going to call this for a vote. All those in favor of the motion as stated, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
That motion will carry 8-1. And we will move then to our next case, which is 14 CPA 01 High House Road. Ms. Redling?
Good evening. This next case is a request to amend the comprehensive plan for 3 parcels totaling 43.85 acres along High House Road in West Cary. The site is located approximately 300 feet east of the intersection of High House and NC Highway 55. And I want to point out the West Park PDD is here. West Park PDD, I'm sorry, is down here. And I think there's a Walmart grocery store and the Starbucks and Biscuitville here. Property owners within 400 feet of the site were notified by mail of this request, and the site was posted with public hearing signs. The existing base zoning is R40. The site is also within a mixed-use overlay district, and that's depicted by the bold blue line. Cary's GIS maps indicate a stream buffer requirement may impact the northern and western portions of the property that's located north of High House Road and the southeastern corner of the property that's located south of High House. Field determinations will be required at the time of site plan review. There are no existing or proposed greenway trails affecting this site. High House Road is designated as a major thoroughfare with 4 lanes and a median and 100-foot right-of-way. There are existing 5-foot sidewalks on both sides. C-Tran provides fixed route bus service along High House Road from Highway 55 to downtown Cary. Triangle Transit provides bus service along Highway 55 from Apex to RTP. There's currently a transfer point between Triangle Transit and C-Tran at the intersection of Highway 55 and High House Road. The parcel on the south side of High House Road contains the historic 1878 Balcom House, which is listed in the Cary-Wake County Architectural and Historic Inventory. In 1991, the house was placed on the state study list for the National Register of Historic Places. This indicates that it appears to be eligible for the National Register. This is a view of the front of the house. It faces High House. And this is a view of the side of the house. The applicant has indicated that the Balcom House will be saved somewhere in the area. The land use plan currently designates the 2 parcels on the north side of High House as appropriate for medium-density residential, defined as 3 to 8 dwelling units per acre. The plan designates the parcel on the south side of High House as appropriate for high density on the western side, transitioning to medium density on the eastern. High density is defined as greater than 8 units per acre. These higher density designations reflect the fact that the subject parcels were planned to be the residential element of the West Park Neighborhood Activity Center. And that's shown, it's in the, within the, the blue boundary. According to the land use plan, the intent of activity centers is to place the town's moderate and higher density residential uses within immediate proximity and short walking distance of the commercial and office core of the activity center, so as to have the greatest impact in reducing the number of vehicle trips on thoroughfares, and also to take advantage of transit stops at activity centers. The applicant is requesting a 2-part amendment to the land use plan. The first part of the amendment request is to remove the subject site from the West Park Neighborhood Activity Center by pushing the activity center boundary back toward the intersection. And the second part of the amendment request is to change the land use of the subject parcels on both sides of High House to low-density residential, which is defined as 1 to 3 units per acre. At the Town Council public hearing, 2 citizens spoke in favor of the CPA request. One was a representative of the Somerset neighborhood, and there were members of that neighborhood in the audience. The other lives in the Wellesley neighborhood. Since the public hearing, I've also received a call from an adjacent landowner who shares a property line with the northern parcels, and he stated his support also for the change to low density. In addition, the speakers mentioned that traffic is a concern, and that's why they wanted it to stay low density, that buffers are important, and they would like to see tree destruction limited. Town Council comments were generally, they stated support for the change to low density. Several members mentioned the current traffic volumes along High House Road and thought that low density made a safer alternative in this particular location. The Land Development Ordinance states that proposals to amend the comprehensive plan should meet 1 or more of the 4 criteria shown here. Staff believes that number 2 has been met. New issues, needs, or opportunities. We believe the subject parcels are infill parcels that need to be compatible with the surrounding low-density neighborhoods that have already been developed all the way around. And low density also provides the opportunity to preserve the historic Balcom House in an appropriate setting. Staff's analysis is as follows. The proposed change to LDR does not fully support the town's activity center concept and goals, which includes placing the town's higher density residential development very close to services and transit and shopping in order to reduce the length and number of vehicle trips. That said, the proposed change to low density residential would still place some future residents, though a reduced number, in close proximity to these services. And as stated earlier, a change to low density would ensure compatibility with surrounding neighborhoods and create an appropriate context for the preservation of the Balcom House. Therefore, after carefully weighing the issues presented by this case, staff believes that the opportunity to provide new residential infill that is compatible with established surrounding neighborhoods and at the same time preserve the historic Balcom House on site, hopefully in its existing location, outweighs on balance the transportation efficiencies that are lost by putting low-density residential at a major intersection. Therefore, staff recommends that this case be forwarded to Town Council with a recommendation for approval. And this concludes staff's presentation, and I'll ask the applicant to come forward to present comments.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to open the public hearing, and we will begin with the applicant, and I remind you, you have 10 minutes.
Good evening. I'm J.W. Sharon with IDS. We've been working with this site over the last 5 or 6 months and meeting with the adjacent residents. And one of the things we were trying to do, the family ended up receiving this property in an estate. And what they've been trying to do is best evaluate how to use what is considered the last developable area along High House Road appropriately, in doing so to respect the family that's had it for all these numbers of years. She mentioned the home, and of course, through the rezoning component of this case, the rezoning on both sides, the home will be saved. The family wants that to happen. But from the CPA side of it, a lot of the discussion came about, what is the highest and best use that gives them compatibility to the existing uses around there. And while looking at the vicinity map, you can see a large volume of single-family development in that area. And I mentioned that because prior to 2000, the town's land use plan used to be in a bubble diagram form. It was not mapped. And then they came back and did an overlay with it that actually specifically designated uses on these tracts. Well, all of these homes that you see around this area were built prior to 2000. And so when they looked at this intersection, and you had all 4 quadrants and non-residential uses, they said, well, this is the only thing left that we could add into it. Let's put it medium density or high density. So you were kind of trying to retrofit something and attach an appendage to something that was really almost fully developed. And during that time, you move down High House Road and you see Davis and High House. And during that time, over the last 10 years, it's become more and more intense, probably much more than most people envisioned. So the traffic increase from a lot of that put pressure down High House Road. So through our neighborhood meetings, the neighborhoods love that it'll be something that's compatible to them. A lot of them were very surprised to even learn that it was not going to potentially be in a low-density designation on the site like they are used to, but yet some could even have a higher density, more condo apartments next to them. So we felt, through discussions too with the neighbors, it's a good combination. You've got enough background traffic in there, and if you pick the best, most compatible use, we feel that single family works here. And so what we're asking to do, we feel would be the best use for this tract for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to address us in this case?
Hello, my name is Jody Everhart, and I am a resident of the Somerset neighborhood, which is just to the north of the north portion of this project. I, back prior to the town council meeting, had spent some time, a few days, going through the neighborhood and asking folks if they supported this proposal, and I I put together a petition of 48 signatures showing full support of the proposal. And of those 48, 75% of the streets that you see in the Somerset neighborhood that align or are directly adjacent to the property were represented. So 76% of those people that I asked approved. The remaining I actually didn't get around to asking, so it's very favorable for us to go to low density. It is very compatible to what we've got going right now. And the only concerns were raised is that as the project is developed, they give serious consideration to the traffic on High House, and specifically around the Sir Walter and Cranbourne intersection, which right now is quite a problem for us. Exiting our neighborhood, it can take, at peak times, sometimes 5 minutes to get out of our neighborhood off of Sir Walter. So whatever they do, we ask that they try to alleviate some of that problem and certainly not add to it. And that's basically the main concern. The other was that we are happy about the 100-foot buffer along the creek bed. There is a lot of wildlife, and we do want to preserve that as well. So, thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to address us?
Good evening. My name is Mike Bader. I live on I live on Cutbury Place in the Wellesley subdivision, which butts up against the proposed property to the southeast, on the southeast side. So I also wanted to express support for the proposed plan amendment. I can attest to the fact that the traffic on High House Road, certain times of the day particularly, is very difficult to get out, particularly the way that they put in the medians. So you have on the Cranbourne entrance to Wellesley, you have the place where cars can either take a left into Wellesley or pull a U-turn and go back up to the other entrance further up in Wellesley. And coming out of the Wellesley community on Cranbourne, you don't know what those cars are planning on doing, if they're taking the left or making a U-turn. So it just kind of presents a challenging situation, particularly when there's a lot of traffic going down that street. So the idea of reducing the density for that property, I think, is definitely something that me and my neighbors definitely applaud. And if there's a way to influence maybe putting a signal or some kind of other traffic policies in place there, so it's easier for people to understand what the other drivers are planning on doing and making it safer in that area, because you got a lot of school kids heading off to the Green Hope High School and other areas, that would be also a great idea. I think also what was presented earlier in terms of concerns, there were two other things that we, or one other thing that we raised at the town council meeting that also I think the council expressed support for that weren't necessarily covered, was just the buffer in the planned development. So it's unclear to me. I know that there's some designation in the report about the street zone buffer from the High House to where the house is on Buncombe, but I don't understand necessarily what the buffer will be on that property as it abuts our neighborhood and the West Park neighborhood, the Wellesley and the West Park neighborhood. So I'd really appreciate some clarity there and would support, a 50-foot buffer. It's a heavily wooded area. I've been there for 20 years. I know when we first moved in, we were first into the Wellesley neighborhood. It took a number of years for the wildlife to come back. Now there's a lot of hawks and falcons and other wildlife that are there, and I hate to see a lot of that wooded area get graded or reduced to the point where we're going to lose a lot of that wildlife. So more clarity on the buffer. I'm not sure exactly how the process works, but it would be great to have an opportunity to understand that before any decisions are finalized. I think that was the primary things I wanted to say, so thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anyone? At this point, I'm going to close the hearing then, and we are going to open this case up for board questions.
I have a couple. The buffer issue that the speaker just brought up, that would be covered in the rezoning case that would follow, is that correct?
Buffers are normally, as I think we would say, discussed or addressed with the site plan, but that doesn't mean they can't be discussed at the rezoning stage, and I think that would be where, if there were any conditions that the applicant wanted to add or something.
And what is the requirement, LDO, between, if this were low-density residential, with the adjoining residential neighborhoods? Do you know?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay.
But I can find out.
And regarding the historic Balcom House, is it correct that the typical place to address that would be a rezoning condition as well, given the intent to preserve it? Or
that would be the right place to discuss that. And because right now we're talking about the generally,
Right.
whether the land use
Right.
generally should change from medium and high to low density, but.
Right. Thank you.
Other questions?
On the, with the proposed low density, 1 to 3 units, so my understanding based on what we heard about grading before is if it was 3 units per acre, then they could do the 25-acre grading because this is over 25 acres, is that correct?
I'm not versed enough to answer that. It sounded like that from the earlier discussion, but I'd have to double check on this.
Okay.
If it applied here.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
What range of zoning, or at the low end, what would be the lowest density that would be allowed under LDR?
The lowest density?
Yes.
Well, it's a range of 1 to 3, so I guess
So one.
1.
One dwelling unit per acre, so R40. Okay.
I mean, that's typically, I mean, if it were less than that, we've not had that addressed.
You would need to go to the LDR.
Well, that's in a different, that's actually within the Southwest Area Plan. That is a category there. I don't know that we may have another district that would be called, not a planning district, but we could go to a lower zoning, like R80, but.
Okay, that's all I have.
Clarification question. Staff report indicates the Balcom House will remain in its original location, but I thought I heard the applicant say it would be relocated. Am I correct on that?
Well, clarification, the staff report, the comments from the planning department were, we hoped it would remain in its original location. I believe the applicant has indicated that it would be saved, but the area, and they've not made a decision yet where.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Just a reminder, we're talking about a land use discussion here. There are some really good questions here that I think will be pertinent when we do a rezoning. Densities, what's going to happen with the historic structure, et cetera. At this point in time, what we're really worried about is it appropriate to reduce the density in the land use plan?
And I have a motion if there's no further questions.
Please.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the board forward case number 14 CPA 01 to Town Council with a recommendation for approval to amend the land use plan as proposed.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second, and Mr. Warner, I think you beat out everyone there. Discussion.
Mr. Chairman, the reason I made the motion is I very much like this reduction in density. I think I prefer a lower density even than LDR. However, LDR is so much better than what we have that very strongly prefer it. I can't think of a single reason against it. And basically having it HDR in this kind of neighborhood would almost be, I would think, a mistake. So I would strongly support any reduction in density. So I'm very pleased to support this.
Other comments?
Yeah, I'll say, I agree. I think, I agree with the owner's vision of lower density residential for this and the staff's analysis that on balance, it is reasonable to reduce the density from what was on the plan from some years ago. And as Mr. Swanstrom said, this is a land use plan, and I think we're talking about low density residential use, and I think I agree with Mr. Shaw that it makes the most sense, and I would just encourage the applicant in particular to look at, during the rezoning, at an appropriate way to save the historic, preserve the historic Balcom House, as the intent has been indicated, and that certainly seems sincere.
I will add, if I may, that I do have some concerns that would affect the rezoning. I've already communicated them with staff, and in fact, we discussed it a little bit earlier. However, there are rezoning issues as far as the comprehensive plan amendment to make it all LDR. I strongly support it.
Other comments? Well, I'm going to pipe in with having been around here for a long time, I get a little bit of historical perspective. There would be a time when we wouldn't dream of doing this, when the activity center concept was sacrosanct, and down zoning or down land using this site right next to an activity center would have been an absolute sacrilege. But times have changed. We've grown. We have traffic issues we didn't anticipate. We have school issues that we didn't anticipate. And so our concept of what we want next to an activity center, at least this kind of, I think this is probably a neighborhood activity center, if I'm correct. Concept of what we wanted to put into an activity center has changed. And because this isn't the first time I've seen this in the last year or so, I'm wondering whether we need to go back and kind of revisit how we define neighborhood activity centers, so that you don't feel this pull from one side, the dogma of land use planning saying that we should be putting higher density here, but the reality of where we are in Cary right now saying, but we can't. So I'm wondering maybe whether we need to revisit that, particularly for these infill projects that are always going to have this conflict. That's just a message to the staff. Imagine Cary will be an outstanding opportunity to perhaps redefine what we want our neighborhood activity centers to look like. I expect we have somebody on this board that has some connection to that activity, and I'm hoping he just made a note on that one.
And one other comment about this is that anything that this board can do or the city council can do to take some pressure, traffic pressure off of High House Road, especially with the problems that we've all seen at Davis and High House, would be a good project. And I don't think, since I've been on this board, that I've seen a case where an applicant has come in and asked for a reduction. That's substantial in my view, and fully support the plan.
Well, as long as you open it up, you're our representative on the Imagine Cary effort, and clearly we need to figure out a different transportation strategy. Being bound by DOT plans, particularly looking at something like the challenges we have on NC 55, are simply not going to allow us to get to where Cary wants to get to, and we got to find a different road. So I'm glad we have a very vocal voice in that effort.
Well, I second what you said about the whole area has changed substantially from when these land use plans were put in place. And activity centers, especially, I keep going back to the Davis and High House, because it's my feeling that if the city had an opportunity to go back and revisit that and do it different, they probably would have. And that's always been sort of the vocal point from citizens about what they don't like about activity centers. But activity centers onto themselves are not a bad idea, but they have to be done in the right way.
I don't envy you the task that you folks are stepping up to. Hopefully you will aggressively go after the comprehensive transportation plan as well, so we don't have to do it here when you're done. Okay, that said, if there are no other comments, I'm going to call this to a vote. All those in favor of the motion as stated, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries unanimously. And we're going to move to our final case for the evening, and that is LDO Round 29. Very aptly given the context here, Round 29 is Historic Preservation Commission. Ms. Redling, you're with us again.
Yes. Next, for your consideration, I'm presenting a series of proposed amendments to the General Town Code and to the Land Development Ordinance. These proposed amendments implement two major recommendations of the Historic Preservation Master Plan, which are to establish a Cary Historic Preservation Commission and to establish a fair and legal administrative framework for conducting a preservation program. The text in the proposed amendments closely follows the state enabling statutes and also follows the guidelines for governments wishing to attain certified local government status. As you can see from your staff report, there are numerous and detailed code amendments that are required to establish an HPC and a preservation program. With this presentation, I'll summarize just the major amendments and then attempt to answer any questions you have about any of them after that. I did want to note that nothing in these proposed amendments establishes an historic district, nor does it create any landmarks. That's a separate process. So to begin with the proposed amendments to the town code, the town code would be amended to add an Historic Preservation Commission as an official town commission. The commission would have is proposed to have 7 members, the majority having special interest or knowledge in architecture or history, and staggered 3-year terms. The LDO amendments, I'll begin here with, in general, the LDO summarizes in Chapter 2 all the entities that administer the any part of the LDO, and this would be a new part, an historic preservation ordinance. So the LDO will be amended to add the roles of all the entities that would be a part of that administration. The role of planning staff would be to review applications for potential landmarks, potential historic districts, and for major certificates of appropriateness. So that'd be a review role that staff would have. Staff would be able to review but approve minor certificates of appropriateness, being applications to do minor changes to established historic properties. The LDO amendments would, in the LDO amendments, we would also establish the role of the HPC to hold public hearings and to recommend potential landmarks, to recommend potential historic districts, to hold public hearings on and approve major certificates of appropriateness. The P&Z Board's role would be to hold public hearings and make recommendations on historic district zoning, because historic districts are a type of zoning overlay. And the Town Council's role in administering this ordinance would be to hold public hearings and designate historic landmarks, and to hold public hearings and designate historic district zoning. So they would remain the final decision on landmarks and historic districts. So the next 2 slides summarize all of the HPC's powers and duties. And you see on this slide everything we've discussed up to now: the nominating, recommending, regulating designated landmarks. Once a landmark is designated by Town Council, then it would be the HPC's duty to regulate that through certificates of appropriateness. The only other thing not mentioned earlier was the HPC has the power and duty to maintain an inventory of historic properties also. And here are some additional duties established for the HPC: to review and comment on National Register nominations, to enter private lands to survey properties. These are powers and duties given to commissions by the state statutes. By request of the Town Council, to prepare historic preservation plans, to conduct educational programs, and to negotiate with owners to find preservation solutions when appropriate. These LDO amendments would also establish that the granting or denying of any certificate of appropriateness may be appealed to the Zoning Board of Adjustment. And I call that out on this slide because just like the Zoning Board of Adjustment, it's a quasi-judicial hearing when you have a major certificate of appropriateness issued and you have a public hearing. So because of that, the correct place to appeal that would be to the Zoning Board of Adjustment. The LDO amendments would also establish procedures for the designation of historic landmarks. So the procedures are all spelled out, as you saw in your staff report. An important thing to note is the owner's permission would be required. before a historic landmark could be nominated or designated. It would require an application and a designation report. There would be a public hearing and a recommendation by the HPC, but the final decision and another public hearing would be by council. The LDO amendments also established procedures for the designation of historic districts, which we have none of right now, but we thought we would go ahead, as that is a power and duty that an HPC has to regulate those. We are putting this in there to show what the process would be should we have one. So a rezoning application is required, just like any other rezoning. The state has the opportunity to comment, but they don't regulate or tell us whether or not we can have it. There's a recommendation by the HPC, but it follows the normal zoning process, and it would be a public hearing and recommendation by the P&Z board, and then a public hearing and final decision by council, should we ever bring forward an historic district. The LDO amendments also will establish procedures for the granting of these certificates of appropriateness, or COAs, for landmarks and historic district properties. So once something is a landmark, or if there would be a local historic district property, then COAs would be required for exterior changes only. And in parentheses, you see, unless the owner, for some reason, there was something very special, agreed to an interior review. I've seen that happen a few times in the past, but it's usually just the exterior. Minor COAs can be approved by staff. These would be for minor things that staff could look at the design guidelines and not hold up anybody, but be able to give them approval within 45 days. Major COAs would be quasi-judicial public hearings and then final decision by the HPC within 180 days. The LDO amendments also establish procedures for the demolition of landmarks or local historic district properties. To have something demolished that is a designated historic structure, an application is required, and the action on the application would have to be within 180 days. A public hearing would be held by the HPC, and the HPC may approve, deny, or approve with conditions such an application for demolition, and I want to explain just what that means. They may approve it as long as it, met the requirements. They can deny, when I say they can approve it, as long as it was, well, they can't actually deny it. So they can approve it. They can deny it, but only if it's a statewide landmark and something that is recognized statewide as an important property, and that would be something that would be, the state would be involved and let us know that. Or they can approve with conditions. So in the end, you can't really deny a demolition, you can only delay it. So the HPC could delay a demolition. They can approve the demolition, but then they could delay it up to 365 days from the date of demolition approval. And the purpose in that would be to allow time for negotiation, to find some type of remedy, moving the property, saving the property, purchase of the property. But it would not mean that every application would be immediately delayed 365 days. It would be if it met the requirements. Some properties, even if they were on, say, in the historic district, it may be clear for some reason that they have to be moved or have to be demolished. If something could be worked out in fewer than 365 days, say 3 months, that's fine too. And then there's, in the LDO amendments, there are waivers for, there's a place that says there can be waivers for extreme hardship, so there's some flexibility in that also. And the LDO amendments also establish that local historic districts are a type of zoning overlay and impose regulations and standards in addition to the underlying zoning. It doesn't take the place of it. And that the local historic district, should we ever have one, would be delineated on the official zoning map. The LDO amendments would also establish penalties for violating the historic preservation ordinance. And for instance, if something happened and a landmark was changed or altered, and did not have a certificate of appropriateness, town council could consider amending or repealing the landmark designation. And if there was a demolition of a designated historic property and they had not gotten the COA, had not gone through the process in the hearing, they just did it without a COA, then the penalty would be no redevelopment plan may be submitted for 48 months from the date of notice of violation for unlawful demolition. But this could be waived for good cause by town council with 3/4 affirmative vote. So at the town council public hearing, which was held on May 8th, there were no public comments, but council did, at the time, they mentioned that they were concerned that the waiver of demolition delay, at the time we had it written that the HPC could grant it, and they said that they would prefer that be granted by town council. And they also mentioned, one member mentioned that should we have an historic district, there was concern that historic district requirements shouldn't apply to non-contributing buildings within the district, or in other words, buildings that weren't historic but just happened to be within the boundaries. So those were the two comments. And then we had the Planning and Zoning Board work session, and you can see here a summary of that. We needed more background on landmarks and historic districts, any financial incentives. Everyone felt clearly that landmark designation should happen only with the owner's permission. A demolition delay, it was pointed out, a demolition delay could potentially last over a year if the time for application review process is included, if you added up that time also. So it could be over 365 days from the date of application, effectively. And a Cary HPC, it was clarified, can't regulate the fringes beyond its ETJ. It would only have jurisdiction over its zoning jurisdiction, which is our town limits and our extraterritorial jurisdiction. So changes since the P&Z work session. We clarified that major COAs require a public hearing. We clarified and put some more text in the amendments to make sure that an owner's consent is required for landmark designation. We added that COAs must require changes to be congruent with the special character of the landmark or district, which is just simply a way of saying COAs can't, properties have to make sure that if a property does not add to the character of a district, then COAs wouldn't need to be required. And it's language taken from the state enabling legislation to make sure that it's a serious decision to issue a COA and that it's held to a standard of properties that truly contribute to the district and require, and that those are the properties that need the COA with the so they could be congruent with the rest of the district. And then we changed the wording to read that a waiver of a demolition delay would be granted by town council and not an HPC, and added to the staff report just additional background on landmarks and historic districts to try to help clear up or just inform the public about financial incentives and what the difference is and things like that, as a one-page fact sheet that people could keep and read. Staff recommends the P&Z Board recommend approval of these proposed amendments, and after the public hearing, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to open the public hearing, and since the town is the applicant here, we've already heard from you, and so we will request input from anyone else. And since the gallery is empty, I think we can assume that we have no one else that would like to speak in this public hearing. So I will close the public hearing and open this case up for board questions.
I have a question. Quick question on the kind of the restrictions that come along with this.
Okay.
So we have a landmark designation in a historic district area. So the restrictions and the timelines and the penalties apply equally to a landmark and a historic district, a contributing property within a historic district? Is that correct?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
Well, except for a landmark. Because a landmark is granted tax deferrals in return for the status of, a penalty could be that if they violated the expectation that the exterior remained, or they got, that they came before the board, that could be removed. Landmark status could be removed by the town council, whereas in an historic district, a contributing property would not necessarily be removed from the district.
Sure.
Right.
But for all intents and purposes, the process, the COA, and the
That's
360-day delay for demolition, it applies equally to the landmark
Yes.
and to the district?
Yes.
Okay. Landmark owner's permission is required. Historic district, if there's 10 houses in a historic district, do all 10 property owners have to consent?
Since it's a type of zoning overlay, by law, by state law, all members don't have to necessarily agree or approve of a district being placed, an overlay being placed. That said, it would be up to town council, I think, to set a policy and, in general, say whether or not a zoning overlay for historic districts is something they would want to hear unanimous consent, a majority, or whether they thought it was in the good of the community to do a zoning overlay without everyone's consent. We have other zoning overlays that in the past we generally meet with everybody and know whether or not there is consent or not, or whether there is a desire for that or not. So I guess the short answer is legally that is not required, but precedent has shown we generally look for citizen, certainly citizen buy-in as much as possible.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
And just to follow up on that, that process would be I'll call it a regular rezoning process that would involve public hearings at the town council, public hearings here. Everyone has a chance to express their opinion.
Right.
People weigh things on balance, the good of the community and the applicants and the property owners' rights and so on.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This may have been covered in previous work sessions, but I didn't see any language here with regard to specifically a definition of an historic landmark property or the district. Is that covered elsewhere within law?
Yes. Well, I'll start with landmarks. Landmarks are to come from the reason that HPCs are given the power and duty to create and maintain an historic inventory is because you have professional architectural historians who go through and survey the whole community and create an inventory. From that inventory, you would draw the properties that rose to the level of landmark, and that would be the pool of potential landmarks. And from those from that pool, you would then, not all surveyed properties or on the inventory would rise to the level of landmark, but that's your pool from which you draw. It doesn't mean that you couldn't ask for something to be considered a landmark because it was overlooked accidentally, but you'd want to add it to the inventory before you applied for it to be a landmark. So it's a matter of prioritization of the inventory that you have created, and the inventory establishes what are the historic properties in the community. For historic districts, you also look at your inventory, and a professional architectural historian begins to see patterns in the inventory and says, you've got a group of properties here that together tell a story or reveal something about a specific era. And so you, again, look to your inventory to look for where some of those districts might bubble up potentially, and that's how you create or begin to create a district, or at least identify where you might want to nominate and pursue further research.
Okay, great, thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Warner?
The 365-day delay, once it's approved for demolition, seems rather substantial, in my view, and an impediment to a landowner from exercising his right or their rights to do with what they will with their own property. First, I agree with the council that that should be their decision, but I would think that something in the neighborhood of 6 months would be a more reasonable time period than an entire year, because once that's issued, they've already went through a process with, you know, making the request, having a hearing before the historic committee, and I just think that it's too long. So just leave that for the record. I'm in agreement with the overall proposal here, but I disagree with that aspect of it.
Okay.
Other comments? Seeing none, I'm going to pipe in with my closing comments. First of all, for anyone that might be watching at home, the gallery is empty, but we had I think, very productive and comprehensive work session on this and spent a good deal of time understanding it. And I would commend the staff, and you in particular, for making this clear to someone like me who didn't have a background in historical preservation. And so I appreciate that. For anyone that might be watching at home, I want to emphasize, this is something that somebody opts into. It isn't something that the town is going to impose upon you. If you opt into it, you opt into it because you're getting a significant tax incentive. And I'm not exactly sure I even understand the details of the tax incentive, but I know it certainly gives you a good reason to do it. So when you opt into these terms and conditions, you're doing so with an open mind, with a clear understanding of what it is you're buying into, and you're getting a pretty good incentive to do it.
Just to clarify, that would be for landmarks.
Okay.
Not for historic district properties, of which we don't have any.
Referencing landmarks.
Right, our current program, which is landmarks, yes.
And then this is just an aside, and I'm only saying it here so it gives me a right to say it to the town council when I report on this. Very often we see situations where we've got really nice buildings, really nice structures in areas where it's going to be very difficult to build around them. Now, we've had a couple of cases recently where the homeowners or the property owners have bent over backwards to find a solution, but we've had some before that where we've lost property because there was no place to put it. And I imagine this might be one of those things we could load into Imagine Cary as well, so I'm going to dump on you again, Mr. Warner. We have a number of great parks in Cary. And one would think that if we have this historic asset that we can either find something to do with or lose, and we have an awful lot of great parks in Cary, perhaps there is some way to bring the two together. And again, I'm saying this so I can suggest it to the town council, and so I can suggest it to our representative on Imagine Cary. And if I hear no other comments, can we have a motion?
I move that the board forward LDO amendments round 29, the Historic Preservation Commission, to town council with a recommendation for approval, as it is consistent with the comprehensive plan and all other applicable plans, and is reasonable and in the public interest for the reasons set forth in the staff report and presentation.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Discussion.
Yeah, I'll say I'll echo your comments, Mr. Swanstrom. We did have an extensive work session, and I do have a background in historic preservation. I've been a volunteer with a nonprofit here in Cary for nearly a decade, and it seems like very often, particularly from other states, the cases that get the publicity are these things that are sort of the heavy hand of government imposing things on property owners, and that the intent here and the language here and the state enabling legislation here is entirely the opposite. As you pointed out, it is something someone seeks because they get an incentive for doing it, as well as they wish to preserve their property. And the penalties and such are apply when someone has chosen to do that, receive those incentives, and then chooses to do something else. So I think it is good for the community. It is an opt-in, as you said. And I think it gives us the legal framework that we've lacked. We've seen cases at nearly every one of our previous meetings for about a year. It seems there's always a historic property involved lately, and as you said, it relies on the goodwill of the applicant and the town and amateur nonprofit organizations who want to get together and do something. And I think this gives us a framework that gives us a balance and helps all of the parties involved, the applicant, the owner, the community, and those who are interested in historic preservation. And as was pointed out, for the historic districts, it follows a regular zoning process. For the landmarks, of which I think we have 7 in Cary about, Ms. Redling. So these are very high-level, unique, high-quality properties. It is an opt-in, owner-initiated kind of thing. So that's my set of comments on this and the reason for the motion. Thank you.
And I'm supporting it because I think that the HPC is an excellent step forward for the town of Cary to address and preserve our historic properties and landmarks. And I enjoy, I think it's an excellent proposal.
Seeing no one else?
One more?
One more?
One more.
I'm sorry,
One
please,
more.
Raj.
No, I have to agree. I think this is a fantastic idea. However, there's one large principle that I just can't get over, which is if a landmark designation is owner approved and historic district is not owner approved, however, the restrictions apply equally to both. And you made a comment that one of the council members said that non-contributing buildings shouldn't, within a district, shouldn't be held to that same standard. Well, if somebody has a property that they don't want in that historic district, even if it meets the historic criteria, well, they should have the option to opt out as well. So for the simple fact that I see kind of the carrot and the stick, the sticks of the regulations being applied equally, however, the consent not being given equally, I'm going to oppose this.
I think you just got some really good input for what we might talk to the town council about.
And which is why I'm opposing on principle, so hopefully the discussion will happen at another
And by
point.
voting against it, you allow it to stay off of consent, which means we can have this conversation.
Thank you very much.
So thank you.
And I would just add that that could also be discussed at the time of any type of historic district rezoning that came forward. That could be brought up and discussed at that time also. You know what I'm saying? So it's not a one-time thing to discuss.
Sure, I just want to make sure it's not crafted where it's baked into the cake ahead of time, and then down the road, these owners don't have that opportunity. I just want to make sure the discussion happens up front.
If there are no other comments, I'll call this for vote. All those in favor of the motion as stated, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
No.
8-1. That motion carries, which concludes our formal agenda tonight. Can we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
We have a motion. We have, Mr. Miller makes a motion. Mr. Warner makes a second. All those in favor of the motion as stated, say aye. 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 Opposed? That motion carries unanimously.
This has been a production of Cary TV. Visit the Town of Cary's website at townofcary.org.